Today, I will be talking about the structure and function of the respiratory system. Before I begin, I would like to go over some medical terminology that I will be using to explain the main function of the respiratory system. Though there is a lot more medical terminology involved to explain the structure and function of the respiratory system, I wanted to emphasize on these that you see on the slide because I myself was very confused when it came down to these sex definitions, especially since they can be easily mixed up with one another. To begin, let's be aware that O2 is oxygen and CO2 is carbon dioxide. Okay, now respiration has three stages in itself. The three stages are external respiration, internal respiration, cellular respiration or cell respiration, and it also involves inspiration and expiration. Therefore, to understand respiration, we have to focus on the three stages along with inspiration and expiration. I'm going to start with explaining that inspiration, inhalation, most commonly heard as inhale, and breathing in are the same thing, and that expiration, exhalation, most commonly heard as exhale, and breathing out are also the same. Now I will talk about the three stages in respiration. Stage 1 is external respiration. External respiration is basically the medical term for breathing, because it is the actions of inspiration and expiration. This is done to bring oxygen into the lungs to interchange O2 with CO2 to ultimately expel the CO2. Stage 2 is internal respiration. Internal respiration is when O2 and CO2 are exchanged within a tissue. This is done when the blood carries O2 to the tissue and allows that tissue to expel the CO2 that it contains, and the CO2 expelled returns to the bloodstream. Stage 3 is cellular or cell respiration. Cell respiration is the process in which cells use O2 converted to energy and completed by making CO2. It is truly incredible how all of these really come together. As we breathe in, we are bringing in oxygen through external respiration. Then, through internal respiration, we place that oxygen that we just inhaled into tissues, and in the tissues, O2 is converted to CO2 through cellular respiration. After this process is done, the CO2 is expelled into the bloodstream by the tissue so the blood can carry it back to the lungs, where we will then exhale to rid the body of that CO2, making respiration a quick cycle. Now we will talk about the structures and locations of the respiratory system. The structures of the system are mainly separated into two parts, the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract, which meet at the neck area, specifically somewhere in the space between the esophagus and the trachea. Here we see a picture of the upper and lower respiratory tract. The respiratory tract begins with the oral and nasal cavities, or the nose and the mouth. Then it proceeds to the pharynx, which is made up of three parts: the nasopharynx, pharynx area behind the nose, the oropharynx, or pharynx area behind the mouth, the laryngopharynx, the larynx, which is also called the voice box because it contains the vocal cords, the epiglottis, and the esophagus. These are the structures that make up the upper respiratory tract. The lower respiratory tract is more complex, but it begins with the space between the esophagus and the trachea, which then proceeds to the lungs and ends with the diaphragm, which is also known as the floor of the respiratory system or respiratory tract. Also note that the lower respiratory tract incorporates the rib cage and the intercostal muscles. The lower respiratory tract is known to be more complex due to the composition of the lungs. Within the lungs, we have the bronchus deriving from the trachea, As we see, here is the trachea and here is the bronchus. Then the bronchus branches off to the primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi. So trachea, bronchus, primary right here, secondary right here, and then the tertiary bronchi, which is all of these little end parts. At the end of each tertiary bronchi, also known as bronchioles, we have the alveoli, where the exchange between CO2 and O2 literally take place. And here is a picture of the alveoli. This is an in-depth picture of a bronchiole or tertiary bronchi. Here we can see the alveolar sac, which is this whole little clump of alveoli, which contain the alveolus, which is each one of these little lumps. And the alveolus contain the alveolar pores. Here we have an alveolar duct and the capillaries, which are color-coded to help us understand how the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is transported. In this exact place is where the magic of gas exchange O2 to CO2 happens. And by the way, alveoli is plural for two or more alveolus. Therefore, here we have the alveoli, and each one is alveolus.